It's with great pleasure that we introduce Jim Stanford to the podium. Considering all that is happening around the world today and during the past few years, it is the perfect time to have Jim Stanford available to provide his analysis on the economic shadows that presently cast their pallor over our time. Jim is a research associate with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, CCPA, and is an economist in the research department of the Canadian Auto Workers. He writes a regular economics column for the Globe and Mail and Rabble. He is also a regular on CBC Television's The National and loves to speak to audiences concerned with building a more democratic, critical approach to economics. He received his master's degree in economics from Cambridge University in England and his PhD from the New School for Social Research in New York City. He was the founding chair of the Progressive Economics Forum, Canada's network of progressive economists. His previous book, Paper Boom, was well reviewed as an accessible critique of the wasteful practices of the financial industry. He has since written Challenging the Market, the Struggle to Regulate Work and Income. Jim's voice and analysis is an important one that provides a strong counterbalance to those economists preaching austerity. His debunking of the recent Drummond Report is gaining more attention by the mainstream media as they seek to make sense of these challenging economic times. Please join me in welcoming Jim Stanford to AMPA.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm very, very honored to be here. I have to say, Ken, where he just had to, for the media scrum there, that was an awesome opening address. I guess we shouldn't be surprised. His name is Ken, after all. Apparently, that's a prerequisite. But anyways, that just laid it out in terms of principles, union principles that could apply to any worker in any walk of life, anywhere in our society. And I'm just thrilled to see teachers embracing those principles of the integrity of collective bargaining, the need for an independent, strong union, and the historical role that we're all playing to fight for labor standards. So thank you very much for what you're doing. I also want to thank you for what you do as teachers in your jobs, in your schools, in your union, obviously, and in your community. At the end, that will be your power. That is how you will win this battle, because you will show that the work that you do is essential to our society and essential to our democracy, frankly. I believe more and more that public education is an essential feature of our democracy. My two daughters have had a wonderful experience with public schools here in Toronto. I should ask, is there any reps here from Parkdale Collegiate? There you go. All right. You're teaching my daughter, Max Baines. And by the way, the dog really did eat her homework. I know you were supposed to hear from the Labour Minister originally this morning. You probably heaved a great sigh of relief that you didn't have to do that. But instead, you got an economist at 10 in the morning. Wow, that's intimidating. If you thought the Drummond Report was intimidating, get the economist up at 10 in the morning. They say an economist is someone who's good with numbers and didn't have the personality to be an accountant. So with that, I will call up the presentation if I can, and I'll note there's a lot of coffee pots outside in the lobby there. As need be. I am wearing two hats today, as the kind introduction noted. My paying job is with the CAW as an economist in their research department. I'm also a volunteer research associate with the CCPA, and I do want to put in a little plug on that regard. The OSSTF has been supporting the CCPA at the national level, and that support has been very important. We are working now to try and establish a provincial office of the CCPA in Ontario that would focus on provincial and municipal issues, because as you all know, the CCPA's national office is in Ottawa, and Ottawa isn't actually part of Ontario, much as the maps falsely indicate. So we clearly need to have a progressive platform in Ontario to critique the the right-wing arguments that are coming at us, to provide the research ammunition to folks like you in the day-to-day struggles. And I look forward to working with OSSTF and other partners as we go forward to try and establish an Ontario presence, a stronger Ontario presence for the CCPA. Please check out our website, policyalternatives.ca. There's a number of materials there, including some responses on the Drummond Commission. I want to talk a little bit about the broader context of this infatuation that we have with deficits and point out what should be some obvious starting facts. Clearly, Ontario's deficit was not caused by rampant, irresponsible overspending, no matter what some of the rhetoric from some of the budget cutters would suggest. Our deficit was created by a very nasty piece of work that happened in 2008, 2009. The technical term for it in economics is the shit hit the fan. Okay. I should, as a good educator, define my terms as I go along. Shit hit the fan means asset portfolios dramatically underperformed analyst expectations, okay, just so I'm clear on that. The shit hit the fan in 08 and 09, a global financial meltdown centered not among unionized workers of any sort, right? Centered among private financial speculators who were trying to make money out of thin air in an irresponsible and unsustainable way, and now we're all paying the price. Including through a deficit. It wasn't just the recession, which was by some measures the worst since the 1930s. It was also the recovery has been very, very weak, historically weak. We've never had a recovery that was so weak. Don Drummond's forecast, we'll talk a bit about the assumptions in it, but one of his forecasts is that the economy will only be growing at 2% a year. And he takes that as given. Normally, in a recovery period, the economy should be growing at 5% a year. So here's again where the problem is deeper, and the problem doesn't lie with either your members or with our members in the CAW. That's why the budget's been so slow to recover. If you try to solve the problem through austerity, taking out the axe and slashing away at public spending, public sector employment, then you're actually going to make the underlying problem worse. And this should be a no-brainer, frankly, but stimulating growth, putting people back to work, paying taxes, is really the way any government has successfully balanced its budget in history, and we cannot forget that fundamental macroeconomic truth. Here's a simple picture. I'll try not to put too many charts and graphs up. I don't know, are the screens working on both sides, by the way? Oh, they're only working over there. Okay, well, I'm sorry about that. Even worse, that means you're all looking to the right, isn't it? That's not what we want. Oh, it's up there now. Okay, okay. Okay, good. Could I ask the techies to turn off those screens so everyone's looking at the left now? That would be preferable in my books. But this is a picture of the provincial deficit over time. If it's above zero, it means it's a surplus. And lo and behold, it wasn't that long ago that Ontario had surpluses. We were paying for the services that we need, including the necessary investments in education that have paid off so well, as Ken's remarks indicated. And we were paying for them as we went. Why? Because people were at work paying taxes. That's how a strong economy and a strong society works. It was only when the recession hit, the financial crisis in 08 and 09, that we sunk into the red. And we are in the red. We aren't as deeply in the red as we predicted we would be. It's important to note in both 09-10 and in 2010-11, the government exceeded its own deficit targets. That is, it overperformed its targets by several $billion in each year and is likely to do so again this year. The deficits have come in consistently smaller than were expected. And that should give us just a little note of caution in the back of our minds when we're looking at some of those doomsday scenarios. So we are in deficit. But it's clearly related to the recession. And any doctor knows that if you misdiagnose the cause of an ailment, you're likely to misdiagnose the cure as well. And that's the risk that we face right now by forgetting the obvious truth that the recession created our deficit. So to solve our deficit, we have to put people back to work. Another way of coming to the same conclusion, I've done a little bit of number crunching and looked at the impact of the not just the recession, but the very sluggish recovery. And the fact that our GDP today in Ontario is about 8 or 10% lower than it should be if we had avoided the recession and just carried on at a normal pace of steady economic growth. Not spectacular growth, just steady economic growth. The fact that the GDP is 8 to 10% lower means provincial revenues are about $10 billion lower than they would have been if we had carried on at that pre-recession pace. There's another thing that happens. It's a double-barreled impact. It's not just that GDP declines, it's also that provincial revenues as a share of GDP also tends to decline a bit during a recession because some of the taxes that governments collect, such as personal income taxes, corporate taxes, and other taxes, tend to be what's called pro-cyclical. That means you get a higher take when the economy is going well, a lower take when the economy is going badly. And that effect also reduces provincial revenues by about $5 billion a year. So I'm a PhD in economics. That's why they hired me at the CAW, so that I could add 10 plus 5 equals 15. 15 billion, okay? I know it's early in the morning, but lo and behold, can anybody tell me roughly what is the provincial deficit supposed to be this year? I can't quite remember that number. Any takers? Survey says $15 billion. Okay, there you go. So that is another way of coming to the same conclusion that our recession is not the result of your fat paycheck and your fat pension and your sick days and everything else that goes on out there, right? You want to see a fat pension, go and look at the defined benefit pension gold-plated agreements that the bank CEOs are still taking home, and they're the goddamn ones who caused this mess, not you. It's always amazing to me that defined benefit is a bad word in the public sector, and it's still a lovely, lovely word in the corporate sector for those at the top of the heap. Another way the recession has created the deficit, of course, is some of the program spending that the government takes on goes up during a recession. The revenues go down. Some of the program spending goes up for income security measures like provincial welfare costs. Also, the discretionary make-work projects that were undertaken that were very important add to the deficit, but those, by and large, are being wound down now. The other impact, of course, is as you go into deficit, then your debt is larger, and then your interest costs on the debt are also larger. So there's many ways in which the recession is making itself felt. On the debt service side, it's important to note that interest rates have been very helpful in this regard. There are other places where very low interest rates have been very harmful, and that's where your pension trustees will have a word with me at the end of the session. But in terms of the public budget, in terms of the provincial budget, the fact that interest rates are very, very low, the government can borrow money for 10 years today at a little bit above 2%, under 3%, and the inflation rate is about 2%. So that means the government can borrow money for 10 years for almost nothing in actual real terms. And that means that, again, all of the fear-mongering about us, getting into a cycle of debt, hitting the debt wall, becoming the Greece of Ontario, et cetera, are absolutely false. Now, we know that recession has created the problem. The lack of recovery has also created the problem. It's actually over 2.5 years now, coming up to 3 years, since we were officially in recovery. Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, declared that the recession was over and the recovery had begun in July 2009. So that's almost 3 years ago now. And we still haven't quite seen it. Here's a technical economic graphic to describe what's happening. There's the poor unemployed guy. He says, there aren't any jobs out there, I give up. Then look at this nerdy statistician from Statistics Canada there. I mean, folks, look at the technical detail in this graph. Look at his thick-lensed glasses. Look at the pocket protector, okay? I mean, we're being as realistic here as we can. He's collecting information. He says, congratulations, you're no longer officially unemployed, okay? And that's the state of the recovery. And that sounds ridiculous, but that actually happened yesterday. I don't know if anybody saw the labor force statistics. The unemployment rate went down. Hooray! From 7.6% to 7.4%. Hooray! But then when you looked at the numbers, why did it go down? Labor force participation, that is the proportion of Canadians who are actively in the labor market, means you're working or actively seeking work to the satisfaction of this nerd from Statistics Canada, okay? participation fell to the lowest level in a decade. And that means Canadians aren't insane. Remember Einstein's definition of insanity is when you keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, okay? Canadians are not insane. We'll be glad to know. They won't bang their head against a wall. If there aren't any jobs, they won't actively seek them, okay? And that is convenient for Stephen Harper in reducing the official unemployment rate. But socially, it's devastating because it means people, especially young people, are giving up. And that is a disaster. It's a disaster socially and economically, and it's also a disaster fiscally. This is a picture, another graph. This shows how bad things were in the recession and how little they've improved since. Instead of looking at the unemployment rate, which depends on whether you're actively seeking work or not, this is the flip side of the coin. This is what's called the employment rate. This is the proportion of working-age Canadians who actually have a job, okay? And we're not even getting into the quality issue, right? Some of these jobs, as you know, are pretty lousy in terms of part-time contract work, insecure agency work, et cetera, et cetera. This just counts everybody who's got a job as a proportion of the population. And you see what happened in the recession. That fell dramatically. That's the steepest decline in employment since the 30s by 2.5 percentage points of the working-age population. Then you see there's been a little bit of clawing back ever since. In fact, this number went down yesterday. I didn't have time to update the graph. At the end there. It fell 2.5 points. It's bounced back by 0.3 points. So that's about 1/8 of the damage done by the recession has been repaired. There's a technical term for this type of graph in the financial world. Some of you may be familiar with. It's called the dead cat bounce. Okay, I do apologize to the Animal Lovers Caucus in the OSSTF, who are also going to have a word with me after the presentation. The gist of it is, if you throw the cat off the balcony and it hits the ground, it bounces a little bit, but the cat is still dead, okay? And this is, in reality, a depiction of the labor market in Canada. It is not good at all. In fact, Stephen Harper has been out, and Jim Flaherty have been out patting themselves on the back for 4 years straight, saying things are tough in Canada, but they're better than anywhere else in the world. And that, if I can invoke another technical term in economics, is unmitigated bullshit. That's a technical term that means hypothesis unsubstantiated by empirical verification, okay? Just again to keep my terms clear. Where you compare Canada to the rest of the world, it's always misleading. They always look at the number of jobs created or the percentage growth in GDP, and that's completely misleading because Canada's population grows much faster than most other industrialized countries. Japan and Germany and so on have zero population growth. So they don't have to create new jobs. We have to create something like 300,000 new jobs a year just to keep up with our population growth. If you make the obvious adjustment, then our performance among other developed countries is right smack in the middle. 17 out of 34 in terms of GDP since 2007, 17 out of 33 in the employment rate, that graph that I just showed you. And it is true that we've done better than some other countries, especially the Americans, who we like to compare ourselves to, although the Americans passed us. In the fourth quarter of last year, they passed us, and they're going to exceed us this year. So even on that score, our bragging rights are wearing thin. And compared to other countries like America, Britain, Ireland, Italy, and so on, where they actually experienced outright bank failures and a collapse in the financial system, we have done better than those countries, no doubt about it. But among the broader set of countries, we've actually performed badly. There are many industrialized countries, including Germany, Korea, Australia, which have done better than Canada. And I just wish those folks in Ottawa would stop with the nauseating self-congratulations and actually look at the real world that Canadians experience. And they'd know we're in trouble, and they would do something about it for a change. So they like to pretend that we're like the glory days of the 2010 Olympic gold medal. We're number one. The true analogy is more like the men's soccer team, I'm sorry to say. Okay, not exactly in the top caliber. I do clarify the gender here. The women's soccer team in Canada is ranked 6th in the world, so they're all right. It's the men who are dragging down our reputation on that score. Are there any math teachers? There must be a few math teachers in the room. Okay, great, thank you. You'll like this part. We're now going to get into the math. Okay, fiscal math 101. A bad recession okay, plus lousy recovery, okay, equals a deficit. And that is the fundamental problem that Drummond and everyone who's listening to Drummond have forgotten about. The Drummond Commission, of course, to say a few words, they had one-sided marching orders from the beginning. They were told to examine public spending, not to look at revenue at all. In fact, he was explicitly ordered not to look at revenue. He ended up looking at a couple of things that could broadly be considered on the revenue side, but there is clearly opportunities on the revenue side to make a contribution to the deficit reduction effort that he ignored and that his directors in the government ignored. The whole thing was about political cover for the government, obviously. To be frank, the Ontario government has taken so far a very easygoing approach to deficit reduction, and that has been correct. Compared to some other provinces which wanted to slash and burn their way to balanced budget immediately, okay, our government in the initial period was fairly relaxed, and the timetable to balance it by 2017-2018 is fairly relaxed. And that is a position that I would absolutely support. It makes much more sense to eliminate the deficit gradually over time instead of slashing and burning your way to a quick balanced budget. That position on their part seems to have changed, though, in terms of they wanted the Drummond Commission to sort of take the issue off the table in the run-up to the election last year to neutralize the attacks on the deficit that they expected to come from Hudak and company, and politically, in a way, it worked. In the short term, Hudak actually ended up endorsing the same very relaxed timetable for deficit reduction as the Liberals did. So, ironically, did the NDP. So you had a very strange situation where all three parties had a fiscal timetable that was virtually identical, which makes you wonder why we bother having elections sometimes, but whatever. Anyways, we were out there, you folks were out there, making the case that this was not the time for slash and burn, and I think that judgment was correct and was endorsed by Ontario voters. Now, in the aftermath of the election, I think they want to suddenly become tough love on the issue of the deficit. They're setting up a situation where they're going to try and balance the budget faster than 2017 is how I would read what's happening. And again, the Drummond Commission is giving them political cover. Mr. Drummond's math, a few points about his assumptions and how they add up. First of all, he adopts a very pessimistic economic growth forecast. And as I've shown, that is going to make it very, very difficult to solve the deficit problem if you're not putting people back to work. Now, is his forecast correct or not? I think it's pessimistic, even given a status quo framework. But the more dangerous aspect is that accepting a situation of stagnation, of permanent stagnation, permanent mass unemployment and underutilization of our human capacities, is admitting failure. If we do that, if we accept the fact that Ontario is in economic trouble and is always going to be in economic trouble, then in a way we're losing the battle before it's even started. We have to challenge the idea that mass unemployment and communities like Windsor and London and Eastern Ontario that are in terrible shape is just the way it is. We have to insist on a program that puts people back to work, not just so that we can pay our bills in the provincial budget, but so that we can build a healthy society. Even on top of that, though, he's got a number of assumptions that make his numbers look ridiculous. He assumes, even given slow economic growth, he assumes provincial revenues are going to grow slower than that slow economic growth. And that's very unusual. Almost always the reverse is true. As the economy recovers, government revenues grow faster than the economy for those reasons that I mentioned earlier in terms of income taxes and corporate taxes being pro-cyclical. That assumption of slower revenue growth than economic growth adds $7 billion to his doomsday scenario. That's a very important assumption, and it's not legitimate. Also, he makes assumptions that interest rates are going to increase dramatically on future debt that's issued by the government. And that's also unbelievable. I mentioned that the government can finance debt at very low rates. What's more, remember, we have debt and bonds that were issued in earlier years in the 80s and 90s at very high interest rates, 10, 11, 12% in some cases, that are coming due and being rolled over at 2% or 3% interest rates. So even if the interest rate on new debt goes up a little bit from where it is today, it's still going to be much lower than the interest that was being paid on the bonds that are coming due. So if you actually look at what's going to happen to interest rates, his interest rate assumption is very pessimistic and adds another $3 or $4 billion. He's got all kinds of other contingency cushions and so on that he says are about being prudent, but in fact, we've learned this from other finance ministers, from Paul Martin at the federal level. He was the master of it. You build in all of these pessimistic assumptions and cushions, and then, lo and behold, you've met your target 1 or 2 or 3 years before you said you were going to go. And then you stand up in the Parliament and you claim victory and you say, thank you to my prudent fiscal management, we've won the battle sooner than we expected, okay? And it's the oldest trick in the finance minister's book, and Drummond has set up the whole exercise to allow the government to do that. He has this perspective, if you've read the book, that the status quo deficit will be $30 billion in 2017. And that builds in all of those negative assumptions, plus the assumption that the government will continue spending at the rate that it was spending before. Well, we all know the government isn't going to keep spending at the rate that it was spending before. So that $30 billion status quo deficit is absolute propaganda. It's shameful that a number like that would get thrown out with the obvious attempt to just scare people into submission. And there's enough math teachers in this room who can put 2 and 2 together. We don't have to accept that unsubstantiated hypothesis, okay, for 1 minute. In terms of the cutbacks that we're looking at, if that whole approach is accepted by the government, and that is to some extent still an if, look back to the election, the Liberals forecast program spending would grow by about 1.8% per year. And that's what was required in their framework to get to a balanced budget by 2017-2018. And interestingly, as I mentioned, the other parties were about the same. In the Drummond forecast, on the other hand, 1.8%. Now that in and of itself is a pretty austere framework. Think about this. If you're measuring the actual real public services that are being delivered to people in Ontario, you have to increase your spending by more than that each year just to keep up with population growth, okay, which is over 1% a year in Ontario, and with inflation, which is around 2% a year. So you have to be growing your spending by about 3% just to stay where you are in real per capita terms, okay? That is to deliver to each Ontarian the same real benefit in education, healthcare services, and other public services. You all know that you can't freeze spending without actually experiencing cutbacks. So 1.8% is what they promised, and the other parties, compared to 3.1%, which you'd need to stay constant in real per capita terms. Drummond, on the other hand, is proposing a 0.5% increase in annual program spending between today and 2017 in order to meet his preferred timetable. And he's in the report, he says 0.8%, but that's a bit misleading because he's basing the report in data that's already almost 2 years out of date. If you compare program spending today to where he thinks you have to get to by 2017, he's looking at 0.5%. So what that means in real per capita terms is going to require eliminating $12 billion a year from program spending by the end of the Liberals' mandate. Here's a graph that shows the Liberal election platform, similar to the other parties in red in the middle. The blue line shows what would be required to keep real program delivery constant in per capita terms, and the black line shows what Drummond is expecting. So we were already, or what Drummond is recommending, we were already looking at austerity in a sense between the blue line and the red line, okay? But Drummond has doubled the stakes. His proposal would see it even twice as much. Here's where the PhD in economics comes in again, folks. 3.1% minus 1.8% equals 1.3%. And 1.8% minus 0.5% is another 1.3%. That means Drummond has doubled the thing. And I did that before a second cup of coffee today, eh? How about that? So that's one way to measure what's at stake with Drummond. Another way to measure it, if you weren't looking at it in real per capita terms, sometimes in our economic accounts we're just looking at the real GDP, the real value of what's out there rather than in per capita terms. In the Liberal platform, you were looking at a slight decrease in real aggregate program spending. That 1.8% again is slightly lower than the 2% annual inflation rate. So never mind per capita terms, even just the real value, the real flow of public services going out there, the Liberal platform was going to see, more than freezing it, actually a slight reduction. because you need 2% a year just to keep it constant. Drummond, as I said, is looking at 0.5%. So he's cutting the real flow of program spending by about 1.5% a year, and that's worth about $7 billion a year annually by the end of this government's mandate. So that's two different ways of calculating it. Think of it as a kind of a bracket, a low estimate and a high estimate. Something between $7 and $12 billion a year in program spending reductions would be required to meet Drummond's timetable, depending on whether you're starting your measurement benchmark in real per capita terms or just real terms. Now, what you do is any economist will admit that it's not just the value of the program spending itself. There are also spin-off benefits because, as you know, teachers earn a salary, and teachers are very good at going out and spending that salary. Am I correct in that regard? Yes. And when they spend that salary, of course, they create jobs in everything from the dry cleaner to the home builder, right, to the latte shop or the Tim Hortons, whichever one you're at on that score. And, of course, you pay taxes from your income, and those taxes are also recycled into further program spending, which also creates jobs. So if you take into account even a conservative estimate of those multiplier impacts, you're looking at taking $10 to $18 billion out of provincial GDP. That's between 1.5% and 3%, basically, of GDP over the next 4 years. And economists call that fiscal drag. That's actually a term. That's a real technical term, unlike the other technical terms I was invoking. And depending on what's happening elsewhere in the economy, that scale of fiscal drag could indeed pull Ontario back into negative territory in terms of our economic growth. So let's have a second look at the fiscal math. Here's a more advanced course in fiscal math than the first one. In this case, the key thing that you look at in terms of managing public debt is not the debt in dollars. This is nonsense. This is where Tim Hudak and his spin doctors go infantile on us by saying, the debt is $400 billion, because it's a big number and they think that we're all stupid. Okay? Like any debt, like your mortgage and anything else, you measure your debt relative to your ability to pay for the debt, to carry the debt. And in this case, our society's ability to carry the debt depends on our GDP. And the debt ratio, that is, the ratio of our debt to our GDP, is what matters. And you'll see, the math teachers in the room, that expression has a numerator and a denominator. Okay? Amazing. Fiscal Math 201 this time, a numerator and a denominator, and the math teachers in the room know that if you want a fraction to get smaller, okay, you can either reduce the numerator or you can increase the denominator. And in fact, if you reduce the numerator but you also reduce the denominator, you haven't changed the value of the fraction. That is a basic piece of fiscal math that, again, has been forgotten, not just in Ontario, but around the world. People say Greece is the warning sign and that Ontario has to avoid being the next Greece. And this is nonsense. Ontario isn't anything like Greece. And at any rate, the problem in Greece is that they forgot the denominator. Okay? The problem in Greece is they forgot the denominator. They started slashing and burning on the dictates of the EU bureaucrats and the IMF bureaucrats, who now admit that they were wrong. They slashed the denominator so badly that the economy went into free fall. So there is austerity in Greece. Belts are being tightened. Teachers' pay and pensions are being cut. Hundreds of thousands of public sector workers have been thrown out of their jobs. Taxes have been increased, yet the GDP is shrinking, and so Greece's debt is still growing as a share of GDP, which is the way to do it. What you have to do is put people back to work, and that's how you'll pay the debt as you go forward. Here is our two measures of our debt ratio, and again, this is just counter medicine to the doom and gloom that's out there. The blue line is the net debt. That's financial debt minus financial assets of the government as a share of GDP. And you'll see it started to rise with the recession, but it's not a night and day difference. It's not a collapse in any regard. The red line is in a way even more sensible. That's the accumulated deficit. This makes an adjustment for the fact that some of the debt has been used to purchase long-run capital assets It's a capital budgeting adjustment. And if you're only looking at, in terms of capital budgeting, the government now uses an accrual accounting method where, just like a business, you don't set aside the full value of a capital expenditure in the year that it was made. You adjust it and amortize it over several years. If you follow that approach, you get the red line instead of the blue line, and you see that we're really only back to where we were a decade ago, which is not catastrophe by any stretch of the imagination. And the way to keep that line steady is both to obviously have a timetable for gradual reduction of the deficit, but to do that on the strength of putting people back to work. And this is where part of our program has to be resisting the austerity, but part of our program is to be our own storyline from the labour movement about how to put Ontario back to work. Because that's the crucial assumption that Drummond makes that predetermines his other conclusions. He's saying Ontarians will not get back to work, and he accepts that wrongly as inevitable. We have to have an answer from the labour movement as to how to put people back to work. The traditional engine of our economic growth in Ontario is not working. Private sector investment is what is supposed to lead a capitalist economy like ours forward. That is, private companies investing in capital, creating jobs because they expect to get profits. We've certainly given them a hell of a big carrot to try and do that in the form of corporate tax reductions at the federal and provincial level and other things that have enhanced corporate profits. Corporate profits are strong, even though the economy is relatively weak. The problem is businesses aren't investing that money. They're sitting on it. And this is where we need to have a job creation strategy. This, again, is where the CCPA could play a role with all of our partners to develop an alternative vision for how to put Ontario back to work. And I can't say that we have all the answers, but I know this is an area we've got to work on. I also know the way to not do this is to shoot ourselves in the foot and take some of our most important employment areas, like education and healthcare, which are two of the strongest job-creating areas in Ontario's economy, and throw them into a crisis as well. One other point I just want to make is that we also have to think about Ontario's problems in the overall context of Canada. One of the reasons that we're experiencing tough economic and fiscal times in Ontario is this whole shift in our national economic trajectory to becoming a so-called energy superpower, as Stephen Harper likes to boast about. The tar sands exports from Alberta, the impact of that on our dollar, and then the subsequent spillover impact on manufacturing in Ontario, but on other things in Ontario too. Tourism, for anyone who's in a border town, you know full well that tourism has been hammered, even worse than manufacturing, by the value of our dollar. And this is a main reason why our recovery in Ontario has been so slow. It also explains why, perversely, we spend, even though there's this whole argument that we've got a deficit because we overspend, in fact, our real spending per capita in Ontario is significantly lower than in other provinces in Canada. Yet despite that, we have a deficit because of our reduced fiscal capacity. And despite that, Ontario still pays in on a net basis to the transfer system between provinces. Ontario gets a small flow of transfer payments through the equalization program, but that's more than overwhelmed by the net contributions that Ontario makes through all the other aspects of the tax and spending program federally. So perversely, Ontario's got the worst deficit in in Canada, but Ontario is still subsidizing the rest of Canada, and it's part of that fiscal effects from the energy boom and the deindustrialization of our country. So this is where we need an even broader agenda. As we're fighting to preserve public services in Ontario, we have to be fighting for a broader economic vision that puts the whole country on the agenda, not just the oil industry. Our tasks now, I think, are clear, and again, Ken outlined them very, very powerfully in his opening remarks. We have to refute the logic of austerity. The Drummond report was a way of providing some political cover for the government, but we shouldn't assume that the government and Drummond are the same thing. So part of our work in the next few months has to be to try and wedge as much space as we can between the government and some of the ridiculous things that Drummond was saying, clearly fighting for public services and labor rights, as your union has done so courageously in the past and will do it again. And then ultimately, I think this is crucial to our victory, is to resist this divide and rule strategy that's being used against us. I work for a largely private sector union. You work in the public sector. There is this mindset of misery loves company out there, right? Have you noticed that? That so-and-so got screwed and lost their job and doesn't have a pension, so why the hell should you have a job and a pension? I want you to lose it too. And the logic of that is utterly, utterly perverse. I think of two people standing out on the sidewalk. Somebody comes along and robs one of them, steals their wallet. And then the police officer comes up to the other one and says, "You've still got a wallet. That's not fair. I'm taking your wallet." Okay? For God's sakes, that doesn't solve anything. The solution is clearly for the two people to join arms and say, "God damn it, give us back our wallets together and we'll move forward." And that's exactly what we've got to do. So good luck in your fight. Thank you for having me. I look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Jim, for successfully dispelling the myth out there that economists are not engaging speakers. We do have a small token of our appreciation. Some OSSTF gear, so you may always keep us close to your heart.
Public sector and private sector. There we go.
And we will, just so you know, we will be making a donation to the CCPA to help their work as well. So
thank you
again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.